We're planning to devote some time from our life every day to move on our spiritual path. But how do we know that this path actually leads anywhere? How do we know that there's actually a self beyond the physical body? So if I'm gonna dedicate some of my time to something, I want to make sure that there's going to be some returns. How do we know? Here's the dilemma you face. The mode of knowing, our tool of knowing, is the mind. It's how I know things. It's how I process my information. It's where my brain is. But the mind cannot know about something beyond the mind. And so a question like this puts us in this very interesting position of saying, you need to convince a part of me that by its nature cannot understand that which I want you to convince me of. See, I know that beautiful Winnie is sitting in front of me. How do I know that? Because my eyes can see her. Now, if I were blind, or I had a mask over my eyes, or there were a wall between us, couldn't see her. She'd still be there, but I couldn't see her. Then maybe she'd speak. So with my ears, I would know. The sound of her voice would create sound waves that would vibrate against my eardrum, and it would give a message to my brain. Ah, that's her voice. But if I were deaf, or I had earplugs in, couldn't hear. Maybe then I'd touch. Sometimes people who are blind, they recognize people by touch. But you see, I require one of my physical senses in order to know she exists. If I had no use of any of my 5 senses, couldn't see her, couldn't hear her, couldn't smell her, couldn't feel her, couldn't taste her, she'd still be there. But I would have no way of knowing she was there. Now, this brings us to our dilemma. Because you cannot see or hear or smell or taste or feel with your fingertips God realization. Or God, for that matter, most of us, unless we're super blessed to have a particular type of darshan. And since the mind is our tool for knowing, this is where so many people say, well, I don't believe in God. Prove it to me, show it to me. But when we say prove it to me, what we're saying is prove it to me through the methods that I have available. Well, you could say the same thing about love. Try convincing a young child who comes home from school, and a young boy in school who says, I'll never fall in love, I'll never get married, girls have the cooties. Right? Now, how are you going to convince this young boy that at 8 years old he thinks girls have the cooties, but really there's going to come a time in his life when he doesn't think girls have the cooties. There's going to come a time in his life where he does fall in love. He certainly may decide not to get married, but he's not going to think girls have the cooties forever. But try to convince him at that age of this thing called love. You can't. All you can do is know and pray that his life should be blessed in such a way as he grows that he also experiences love. Because once you've experienced it, The fact that you can't see it or hear it or smell it or taste it or touch it is irrelevant. Nobody can convince you that love doesn't exist if you've ever been in love. Because we know. And this is where, when we look at our spiritual practice and our spiritual path, we have to use a means of knowing other than the five senses. As long as we relegate our knowing to those five senses, then we limit our entire lives to only those things we can know through these senses. And this is where the practice of meditation becomes so important, is it gets us in touch with what you can call a sixth sense. Another way of knowing. It's not that we only have five senses. Science only talks about five. There's a lot more senses than that. But we have to look inward for another way of knowing. Anybody who has experienced God or the divine or the universe or light or spirit, whatever word we use, it doesn't matter, has that understanding just like anybody who's ever been in love has that understanding. But we have to look in for that way of knowing. And until we have that, this is where our faith comes in. This is where we look around at people who are on a spiritual path, because this is the only way that we know anything. So many times I'll have youngsters come up to me who have just gone off to college, and in Indian families particularly, they grow up so sheltered and so protected and so untempted because there's no environment for temptation. And now they go off to college and their parents have said to them, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. And they'll come to me and they'll say, well, is it really so bad? Why not? What's the problem? What's one taste? What's one time? And what I always tell them is, it's not about one taste or one time. Nobody's ever died from one sip of alcohol, unless you happen to be allergic. Nobody's ever died from trying a cigarette. But the problem becomes, it's never once. And where does it lead us in our life? And this is where, what I always say to these youngsters is, it's not about what you do at 19 or 20 or 21. It's about where do you want to go with your life. And don't believe me, don't believe your parents. Look around, find somebody who's 40, who's 45, who's 50, who's been drinking alcohol their whole lives, who's an alcoholic. Somebody who's a smoker. Somebody who's a gambler, somebody who's a drug addict. Somebody who thinks it would be fun to just live homeless on a beach. And ask yourselves, is that where I want to end up? There's nothing objectively wrong. I'm not the moral police. God hasn't put me in charge of how people live their lives. If people want to be alcoholics and drug addicts, they've absolutely got the right to do that. But we each have to make a choice for our own lives, which is that where I want to go? And if it's not where I want to go, then I can't get on the same train that they're on. And clearly the train that they're on began at some point with saying, well, what's the problem with just once? What's the problem with just a little bit? And if you know you don't want to end up at that destination, then why get on the train? Sure, you can get off at some point, but why take that risk of jumping off a moving train if you know it's not where I want to go? Why get on? And on the flip side, Look around at people who are where you want to go. People who have in their lives what you're looking for. Not just on the superficial level, not people who just have driveways full of Mercedes, but who need pills to fall asleep at night or on antidepressants and, whose lives are miserable. But people who really have something you're looking for, who have the joy, who have the peace, who have the meaning. I mean, I'm not going to tell you what you're looking for. You know what you're looking for. And so you look around at people who have that. And then you say, well, what train did they get on? And until I've had the inner experience with that sixth way of knowing, we use our faith of people who have where I want to go. And say to them, and really you don't have to trust me, do a poll, do your own scientific study, ask everybody. What do you do? Why are you so peaceful? Why are you so happy? Why do your eyes shine? Why do you have such a beautiful vibration that I just always want to be near you? Ask them what they do. And my guess is what you're going to hear is a lot of talk about spirituality. And it may be people of different religions. Their spiritual path may certainly entail a lot of different things. But in my life, I know, on a personal level, the only people who have something that I would say, that's where I want to go. That was what made me make the decision to be here in the first place. Was I looked around, I was 25, I looked around at the people, and I thought, I don't want to be where they are when I'm 45 or 50. And then I looked at Puja Swamiji. And I thought, well, all right, I'm probably not going to get there in this life, but at least that's the train I want to be on. That's going the way I need to go. Where it's going to take me, who knows? But at least that's the right train to get on. And so that's how we make these decisions.